standing in my name, where it seeks to basically provide a timeline in terms of members when they submit questions and motions to the National Assembly, and in order to get it on the order paper in what one can consider to be a timely manner. So it is a very simple motion in my view, Comrade Speaker, and I am not certain what is the executive side, the executive arm of government's side position on this motion, but permit me to just read the motion for the clarity of all. And it states, whereas questions and motions submitted by members of the National Assembly require approval from the Speaker of the National Assembly before the Clerk of the National Assembly prepares and circulate to members a notice paper. Be it resolved that Standing Order number 22 be removed and replaced with questions and motions submitted to the Clerk of the National Assembly must be submitted to the Speaker of the National Assembly within 4 days of receipt, who shall consider the questions and motions. Be it further resolved that Standing Order number 23 be inserted and now reads, if the Speaker is of the opinion that any question of which a member has given notice to the clerk, or which a member has sought permission to ask without notice, is an abuse of the rights of questioning or infringes any of the provisions of this or any other standing order, he or she may within 4 days direct that A, it be printed or asked with such alterations as he or she may direct, or B, that the member concerned be informed that the question is inadmissible. Be it further resolved that Standing Order number 27-2 be amended to now read, if the Speaker is of the opinion that any notice of motion which has been received by the Clerk of the National Assembly infringes the provision of any standing order or is in any other way out of order, he or she may within 4 days direct that the member concerned be informed that the notice of motion is out of order, or that the notice of motion be entered in the order book with such alterations as he or she may direct. Sir, it is a very, very simple motion, and it seeks to amend the standing order, as everyone present here will know, to basically provide a timeline of 4 days for the clerk and 4 days for the speaker to determine on questions and motions so that it can be placed on the order paper in a timely manner and be brought to this National Assembly for consideration. And with that, sir, I so move, and I hope it finds consensus in this Honorable House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. Mr. Mahipal. Honorable Member, Mr. Sanjeev Datta.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable Member, Mr. Datta.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to not support the motion by the Honorable Member, Mr. Mahipal. The motion, Mr. Speaker, in simple terms, seems to seek to put time limits on the clerk. When he receives a motion, he has 4 days, and he must send it to the speaker. And that the motion seeks to also give the speaker, yourself, 4 days within which to deal with it. The first and obvious query, Mr. Speaker, is why not 5? Or 6? Or 3? Or, Mr. Speaker, this came about when the honorable member was probably sitting on the imaginary SOPs in Congress Place having a cigarette. And by divine intervention, the number 4 came to him. And as a result, he wants to subject the entire nation to his numbers. But we remember the last time that the opposition sought to subject the nation to numbers. They couldn't add to 65. They couldn't divide what is the majority. But they come to the House to tell the Speaker that you should act within 4 days. They tell the clerk that you should act within 4 days. Mr. Speaker, we must understand the role of the Speaker. Erskine May, in his most recent edition, says, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, the role of the Speaker, the primary role of the Speaker is to preside over proceedings in the chambers and committees and the whole House. Also required is to pronounce on motions. Specifically, as this morning, the Speaker can disallow matters that are sub judice. He can disallow matters that he feels, in his own judgment, offends the standing order. Paragraph 4.49 of Erskine May. Now, Mr. Speaker, the role of the Speaker to pronounce on what happens in this Parliament requires deliberate judgment. But yet we have here the honorable member saying when that judgment should be made. It's as if, Mr. Speaker, the honorable member thinks that the clerk and the Speaker of this assembly are simply waiting for frivolous motions which are filed by the honorable member to come to this House and they have nothing else to do. But what about deliberate judgment, Mr. Speaker? How is that to be exercised and made? How is the Speaker to research, to receive advice? How is the clerk to do that? What happens if this is filed the day before Good Friday? What do we mean by 4 days? Do we count weekends? Do we count holidays? Again, Mr. Speaker, the question is, how could one member come and decide, arbitrarily of course, that 4 days is sufficient? How could you decide that the matters in this House must be to the whim and fancy of the honorable member? Mr. Speaker, what astonishes me is that members of the honorable members of the House in the opposition come to this House and apparently speak as if history never existed. They speak in this House about wanting the high ideals and lofty goals of democracy, of transparency. They preach it now. Last year, the Honorable Attorney General passed in 1 year more legislation than was passed in the opposition for 5 years when they were in government. 1 year, the Honorable Attorney General did that. Mr. Speaker, we had the honorable member comes to this House and says that he wants things to move quickly so that there should be time limits. But when in the last government and the last Speaker and motions were filed, no confidence motion was brought, the Speaker in his own deliberation decided it could not be heard until the local government and the budget had been heard. Mr. Speaker, that is the Speaker's prerogative to decide on how to run the House. Recently, Your Honor, in Annette Ferguson litigation, the prorogation of Parliament, Mr. Ramjatan, is a power that exists. So exercise lawful powers. Don't speak of Russians. Don't speak of rigging. Don't try to rig and then come in this house and prepare as if you are holier than thou and you want the Parliament to function above board. You want transparency. Transparency means that you allow the Speaker and the clerk to do his job. That is what transparency means. Not that you fetter the discretion, tell them how to act, tell them when to act. Because God knows if you could have done that in 2020, where we would have been. Thankfully, you couldn't. He wouldn't allow you. But Mr. Speaker, again, I digress. Mr. Speaker, recently, 8 members of this House and the Honorable Member, Ms. Annette Ferguson, is in whose name the matter is reported. But the Honorable Member, Mr. Mahi Paul, was also a member to that. They were suspended by this House because they tried to interrupt the proceedings. They scrambled the mace. They wanted to stop you, Mr. Speaker, from conducting the proceedings. They wanted to stop the Honorable Member, Minister Mr. Ashney Singh, from speaking. Disrupted the entire Parliament. Mr. Speaker, these are the people who come to this House, honorable members, and say that they want the high and lofty ideals of democracy and transparency. And then they went to court to challenge the suspension by this House. And it was the right of the judge to tell you that she cannot interfere in the proceedings of this House, and that the determination of proceedings in this House is for this House alone. Another case, Mr. Speaker, it is not that the Guyanese people are litigious or we are any more litigious than anywhere else in the world. But we have had unique circumstances, Mr. Speaker, where apparently English language is treated as a foreign language here, where simple constitutional provisions could not be understood for what they mean. And we want to now change because the honorable member does not understand, Mr. Speaker. The standing orders is an entire framework. And in that framework, it provides what each actor must do. And does not understand that every public official must act with due alacrity. And the courts have said repeatedly, reasonableness is the guiding principle. Reasonableness should never, ever be interfered with. The discretion when a decision maker must act must be the discretion of that decision maker. You might not agree with it, but there could be more than one response that are all reasonable, and the decision maker is entitled to do so. Mr. Speaker, so we have a motion that seeks, on the face of it, to remove Standing Order 22 and replace it with questions and motions submitted to the clerk must be submitted to the Speaker of the National Assembly within 4 days. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am well aware the definition of days and the counting of time is provided for in every rule book and every set of rules. But, Mr. Speaker, we must also understand that when we put compulsory orders, we are fettering the discretion of the decision maker. Now, Mr. Speaker, so when we seek to set timelines that are so aggressive, Mr. Speaker, one cannot help but believe, understand that what is being sought is in fact to dictate to the decision maker by putting the pressure of such aggressive timelines. Now, we all know that deliberate consideration requires not only the decision maker coming to a decision, but the opportunity of the decision maker to receive advice if he wishes, to do research if he wishes, and to come to his own deliberate judgment. The imposition of 4 days is so aggressive that it smacks of dictatorship. It smacks of control. It smacks of removing of the discretion. This is what was happening. Now, Mr. Speaker, again, unbelievably so, the honorable members of the opposition who wanted to direct electoral officials what to do, who wanted to tell public officials what to do. The coercion of what was going on was unbelievable. You would not have thought that in a modern democracy in 2020 that could ever happen. But it happened before the eyes of the world. Even in the courts, it was unmistakable who were the lawyers representing the officials from GCOM who had an apparent attack that they couldn't read English. They couldn't understand maths. All of this, Mr. Speaker, and we have the members of the opposition coming to this House and trying to say that we believe in the lofty ideals of democracy and transparency. Mr. Speaker, the imposition of 4 days is really and truly an attempt at corruption masquerading as transparency. That is what it is. Make no mistake, an aggressive timeline like 4 days is intended to put pressure on the decision maker, is intended to influence and intimidate the decision maker, and should never be countenanced in this House. The Speaker is independent. The Speaker is like a judge, the independent voice in this House. And the Speaker should never be muzzled. The Speaker and the clerk are the only things, Mr. Speaker, 5 years ago that stood between Guyana and the deep blue sea. It must stand always so that the nation must benefit from that. Mr. Speaker, everyone saw the no confidence motion. Everyone saw the attempts to have the vote suspended in the middle of the vote and have the votes retaken. We saw that, but thankfully a timeout was sought. But Mr. Speaker, thankfully, the Speaker stood his ground and he did what procedure and the rules dictated. The rules dictate, Mr. Speaker, that every member must file a motion to the clerk. It provides that the clerk must forward the motion to the speaker. It provides that if the speaker is of the opinion that there are any reason for the motion to be disallowed, or parts of the motion to be disallowed, that he is to so dictate. Mr. Speaker, today, we had an adjudication on a sub judice matter. This is the role and function of the Speaker. And every attempt to infringe upon that independent discretion or to fetter it must be resisted. It is not comparable, Mr. Speaker, to legislation that refer to judges and give 3 months and 6 months timeline. Those are not aggressive timelines. Those are not aggressive that you will say within 4 days. Within 4 days, Mr. Speaker, what about the other functions that the Speaker performs? What about the other duties of the clerk? Mr. Speaker, this motion is respectfully not worth the paper it is written on. It is a masquerade where the honorable member himself has decided for an entire nation that 4 days is enough. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member has not ventured to us a reason why 4 days was so appropriate. He has not suggested why 4 is better than 5. He's not suggested why not 14 days. He's not suggested what, of course, happens if the Speaker were to disregard him. What are we going to do, Mr. Speaker? The courts have no power over what goes on in this House. So again, you haven't thought it out very much if you cannot appreciate that when you make those rules, you must have some coercive power. And there is a reason why throughout the Commonwealth, in all the islands of the Caribbean and the United Kingdom, such stringent and aggressive timelines do not exist. And there is a reason. Well, you could speak when it is your turn. Again, English is a foreign language. We wouldn't hold our breath, but you're free to bring it up. But Mr. Speaker, when we go through it, we have to ask, why? Why is this necessary? And why is the honorable member so bent on 4 days? Mr. Speaker, well, if he's not bent on 4 days, he could have further amount of time as the House deems reasonable. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not what he said. He said 4 days, Mr. Ramchatan. 4 days is 4 days. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is one. No, they don't understand that time means time. They don't understand that rules, when you make them, you should obey them. They don't understand that when you hold an election and it says you must come from the SOPs, it means goddamn SOPs, not spreadsheets, not bed sheets. But you didn't understand that either, because you treat laws as guidelines, not binding in effect. You treat them as suppositions. Now, Mr. Speaker, they haven't paid me. So, but But, Mr. Speaker, we now come to the critical matter. Repeatedly we have in this House, Mr. Speaker, motions and behavior by the honorable members in the opposition, which are clearly outside the rules, which are disallowed. We even have situations in this House where the proceedings of this House are not